introduce myself. My name is Nabila Puspa Amara and my lesson number is 168. So today's topic of my podcast is what is Orientalism and can we ever be truly natural talking about Orientalism? So when we study religion, culture or history, especially in college, we're often taught to be neutral and objective. That's the cool, right? But the truth is being completely neutral is actually impossible. Every single one of us has a background. We have a nationality, a culture, a gender, a religion, or maybe no religion at all. That affects, and all of that affects the way we see the world. And most of the time, we're not even aware of these biases. We don't choose them, they're just part of who we are. So today, I want to talk about how this problem shows up in academic studies, especially when Western scholars study the Middle East. This brings us to an important idea called Orientalism. Okay, let's move to main discussion. So first, let's be clear. Bias doesn't mean someone is lying or being intentionally unfair. A lot of researchers genuinely want to understand the cultures, religions they study. But even with good intentions, the way knowledge is produced is still influenced by history and power. And for a long time, Western scholars who studied the Middle East were called Orientalists. Back then, the word was not really negative. Many of these scholars learned local languages, traveled a lot, and even admired the cultures they studied. But the problem was not always what they studied, it was how they talk about it. And in 1978, Palestinian scholars named Edward Said wrote a very famous book called Orientalism. And in this book, he explained that Western studies of the Middle East often support colonial ideas even without realizing it. At that time, European and at the time, European countries like Britain and France were controlling large parts of the Middle East. So, Western scholars were writing about regions that their countries also ruled. What Said pointed, point out was that the East was often described as irrational, backward, emotional, or exotic, while the West was shown as rational, modern, and superior. This created a strong us versus them way of thinking. The East became the other, and the West became the standard everyone was compared to. Okay, and another big issue was that people from the Middle East were rarely allowed to speak for themselves. Instead of listening to how Muslims, Arab, or local community understood their own beliefs and cultures, Western scholars explain them from the outside. For example, Islam was often described as violent or unable to change ideas that are still common today. Because of Said's book, academia started to change. Scholars began to realize that pretending to be completely objective could actually be dangerous. Instead, many researchers today try to be honest about their background and ask questions like, where am I speaking from? How might my position affect what I'm saying? This doesn't mean that Western scholars are not allowed to study the Middle East. That idea can be just as harmful. If we completely reject scholars based on where they come from, we just create new division. The goal now is conversation, cooperation, and listening to voices from inside the culture being studied, not just outside observers. And okay, so in the end, we just got in the conclusion part. So in the end, Orientalism teach us an important lessons like knowledge is never completely neutral. Our job is not to pretend we have no bias, but to be aware of it and try to work against it. Edward said Orientalism is still important today because it reminds us to be careful about how we talk to others' cultures and religions. So, if we stay self aware, open to criticism, and willing to listen, studying religion and culture can help build understanding instead of stereotypes. And honestly, that's what good scholarship and good conversations should be about. So that brings that brings us to the end of today's discussion. I hope this episode helped you think a bit more critically about bias, objectivity, and the idea of Orientalism in academic study. So, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this podcast. I really appreciate your attention and support. I hope you found this episode useful and thought provoking. Until next time, thank you and take care.